We're really happy to have our Dean, Jim Steinberg, today for this Conversation in Conflict Studies, which, as many of you know, we have many repeat guests, is a weekly speaker series sponsored by the Program for the Advancement of Research on Conflict and Collaboration. Jim is here really to talk a bit about the contents of this book, Strategic Reassurance and Resolve, U.S.-China Relations in the 21st Century, which was recently published with Michael O'Hanlon to wonderful reviews. And again, no surprise that the book is getting wonderful reviews because I think, as most of you know, Jim is really one of the foremost thinkers today in foreign policy. And during his time with the State Department, particularly as Deputy Secretary, he really was the architect of our current foreign policy in relation to Asia and China. So with that, I want to turn it over to Jim. Thank you.
It's great to be here. Can you all hear me okay? Appreciate so many of you coming out. I hope the pizza's good. So this is a series of conversations about conflict, so I'm going to talk about the prospects for conflict in East Asia, and particularly conflict between the United States and China. Although obviously it's a broader dynamic, and many of the issues around the potential for conflict between the United States and China also have to do with relations between and among the countries in the region as well. So I'll touch on that as well. And I think it should be apparent to anybody who follows the day-to-day headlines that this doesn't feel like an entirely abstract or theoretical question, that there's been growing attention to and concern about the possibility of conflict in the East Asia region. And it's an interesting and somewhat curious fact. And on the one hand, if you look at East Asia over the last half century, it's actually been a relatively peaceable region. We obviously had a major conflict in World War II, quite large conflict during the Korean War, and for the United States, a significant conflict with the Vietnam War. But really, since the mid-1970s, there have been some sporadic engagements. There was a conflict between China and Vietnam, the like, and certainly regional tensions. But this has not been a region that's been characterized by great high levels of conflict. And if you had to make a sort of a broad observation, it seems like it's been a place that has largely focused on economic growth and development. And although there are important differences among countries in the region, it has not been a theater for war. So it seems somewhat surprising that there seems so much attention now on the possibility of conflict. So why is that? How realistic is it? And what might be the sources and causes of conflict? Well, there are, in the past, much of the tension in the region had to do with ideological differences. It was obviously an important front line during the Cold War with significant countries in East Asia, particularly China and the Soviet Union, on one side of the Cold War with some allies, and the United States and its strategic allies on the other side. But that source of conflict disappeared with the end of the Cold War, the collapse of the Soviet Union, and the turn away of China from communism, certainly as an aspect of its foreign policy, and arguably significantly as an aspect of its domestic policy. So while there are still differences in perspective on exactly how economies should govern, and certainly differences about domestic political governance around democracy and human rights and the like, there's not a kind of a deep ideological conflict that would be a source of division in the region. Possible exception with North Korea, and we can talk about North Korea. I'm not going to deal with much with Korean Peninsula contingencies, which is certainly in some ways the most obvious flash zone in the region. But it's hard to see ideology as a major source of conflict in the region. And similarly on the economic front, although there are certainly important trade and economic disputes among the countries in the region, what we've seen over the last 30 or 40 years, particularly since the advent of reform and opening up in China, is a great deal of convergence on the economic front, and especially a great deal of economic integration. The development of regional and global supply chains, the relationships among the countries in the region, the relatively open trading system that's developed in the region has led to a high degree of interpenetration and interdependence as most of the economies in the region have become very dependent on international trade for their own economic growth, both as a source of raw materials on the one hand and as export-driven economies, particularly for the developing countries, China and the countries of Southeast Asia. So, well, we have trade disputes, arguments about intellectual property, arguments about state capitalism and the like. These don't feel like the kinds of things that would lead to major conflicts. There are obviously some disputes about resources and the like, but on the whole, each of the countries have a great stake in their connections with each other, and most would probably see trade and economic relations as an emollient rather than a source of conflict. So where does the conflict come from? What are the potentials and where are the areas of dispute? Well, one obvious one, and the one that's gotten a great deal of attention, is territory. And it's pretty obvious throughout human history, disputes over territory have been an important source of contention. And there are some significant territorial disagreements within the region, among the countries in the region. A lot has focused on the disagreements between China and its neighbors, particularly with respect to claims in the South China Sea and the East China Sea. But there are other disagreements as well. The countries in Southeast Asia have their own competing claims in the South China Sea. There are disagreements between Japan and Korea over the Takashima, Tokto Islands, and the like. And so there are some territorial disputes. And yet even those, although they get a lot of headlines, are kind of curious. They're largely about relatively inconsequential land masses, certainly many of these uninhabited islands. They have potential economic consequences as claimants to territory also are making claims to maritime features and access to maritime-based resources. But even there, fishing is reasonably productive, but it's not the most powerful economic driver for most of the countries in the region. And the subsea resources, oil and gas, are present and non-trivial, but not of the game-changing category that you think about major sources of oil and gas, like in the Persian Gulf, or these remarkable new finds, for example, off Brazil. They're valuable, but even there, these have been around for a while, and until recently, most of the countries in the region have been trying to manage these problems through joint exploration and common efforts. And so while there have been clearly issues around how do you divide up the pie and how would you handle these joint exploration efforts, whether it's in the East China Sea or the South China Sea, until the mid to late 2000s, it didn't feel like this too was going to be a reason for countries to go to war. Now, the other great flashpoint over the last 50 years that seemed like a potential source of disagreement were the tensions across the Taiwan Straits. It's a sort of a territorial dispute. Obviously, the PRC views Taiwan as an indispensable and undividable part of China. And there have been great tensions since the Chinese Civil War over Chinese claims and Taiwan's autonomy over the islands of Formosa and the associated islands. But again, there, if you look certainly in the last decade or so, particularly under the KMT government in Taiwan, the differences are there. The long-term question about the resolution of Taiwan's status is a big and consequential issue, but there have been deepened economic ties, the three links, more political engagement across the straits, a little bit of uncertainty about what would happen if the DPP were to win in 2016. But again, it doesn't have that feel, at least in recent years, at least since the mid-1990s through the early 2000s, of a place where a military conflict feels ripe to break out. So why, given this landscape, close economic ties, no obvious major sources of conflict, is there so much attention to the region? Why is it that the Obama administration is so focused on the pivot? Why are there so many articles in both the general journals and the academic journals about the possibility of conflict in East Asia so prominent? And of course, for those of you who are IR students here, you'll recognize that this is the core sense that conflict is in the wings, is in the offing here, goes to some very core perceptions about the nature of the international system and international relations, and particularly about the possibilities of cooperation and conflict during periods of power transitions, right? And that the dominant feature, which has preoccupied both the academics and the theorists and the practitioners, is the fundamental question about whether the rise of China is inherently a source of instability and one that is likely to produce conflict. And again, for all of you IR students, this is a very familiar story that goes back to the place where we all who study international relations begin, which is with Thucydides and the Peloponnesian Wars, and the fear that the rise of Athens and the fear that it incited in Sparta being seen as the source of the Peloponnesian Wars. And there's been an enormous amount of tension by both practitioners and scholars, particularly in the last decade as China has really dramatically taken off economically, as to whether there is an iron law of international relations and human history that suggests that in a situation where there's a dominant or quasi-hegemonic power like the United States and a rising power, whether that inherently is a source of instability and conflict, or whether the current case can be distinguished from other cases in the past, beginning with Thucydides, but up and through World War I, in which it's possible to manage either a peaceful transition to a new political arrangements with the accommodation of the rising power, or at least a new form of cooperation. And that has preoccupied the great theorists and historians who think about international relations, and is the focus of the book that Mike and I wrote. So how should we think about this? Is it an iron law of history or of international relations? Is this yet another example of the tragedy of international relations, as John Mearsheimer would have it, who's been long predicting that this will be the next great source of conflict, or is something else going on here? Now, the traditional view basically sees this as an inherent source of conflict. The Mearsheimer view that states inevitably compete over power, and that there is an inevitable competition which can often take the form of military conflict unless the dominant power is willing to accommodate the rising power. But history suggests that dominant powers are very unlikely to want to do that because they have to give up things that they don't want to give up. And for those of that view, the realist perspective, and looking at history, they suggest that there's every reason to believe that this rather tragic pattern is likely to repeat itself in East Asia. On the other hand, so that's a very pessimistic assessment that basically says, like it or not, and really independent of the specific cases and what's going on in the United States and what's going on in China, that there's reason to believe that this is a relationship which is going to be very conflict prone. On the other hand, there's a set of theoretical perspectives that suggests that whatever is the case with respect to some political power rivalries, that the nature of the current international system is one that should lead us to be more optimistic. The so-called liberal internationalists, people like John Eikenberry and like who would suggest that the deep interdependence of states in the current international system, particularly on the economic front, but also other kinds of interdependences, global public health, global climate change, all these things in which countries are much more linked together now, suggests that the zero-sum model of international relations, the realist model, is way too pessimistic, and that in fact states now have powerful reasons to cooperate and powerful disincentives to engage in conflict. And whatever the sources of rivalry about power competition, that they will be more than made up for by the strong incentives that states have to capture the plus-sum gains that come from cooperation. And especially if you look at the economic relationships between the United States and China and the United States and its other trading powers in Asia, it would be irrational, counterproductive, and therefore unlikely that states in the region would go to war, even though they have potential things that they disagree about, like territory and other issues, that this incentive to capture the gains of cooperation will, if not a guarantee of peace, at least provide a significant reason for states to be cautious, restrained, and to seek ways to mitigate their differences and to negotiate their differences. So those are the two poles at their most extreme, one that suggests that war is essentially inevitable unless the dominant power capitulates, and at the other extreme one that says that war is practically impossible unless states behave so irrationally that they do things that are hugely damaging to their self-interest. One obviously suggests it doesn't matter what policymakers do, it's going to go badly, and we might as well get used to it and prepare for it. You know, understand that war is coming, we better get ready, and each side should take the steps now to prepare itself for the coming conflict. The second suggesting that, you know, all this doom and gloom is misplaced. The forces of international relations are going to accommodate us, and therefore we should not give in to this fear-mongering that the other side is advocating. And then, of course, like most of these things, there are views in between. And the views in between take the form that suggests that war is neither inevitable nor impossible, but that there are a set of circumstances that might lead to conflict, but there also may be things that the states in the region can do to reduce the chances of conflict. And it won't surprise you as well that the view that Mike and I take in the book that comes from both our understanding of the nature of the international system and that region, but also our own engagement in practice, gives us reasons to be neither as optimistic as the liberal internationalists nor as pessimistic as some of the realists. So let's start with why are we less optimistic than the liberal internationalists? And I think the reason is, one, history suggests that even in cases where states have a lot of interdependence and a lot to gain from cooperation and a lot to lose from conflict, that nonetheless they fall into conflict. And as we sit here now, 100 plus 1 years after the anniversary of the onset of World War I, students of World War I see this as kind of the classic case of a circumstance in which there was a tremendous amount of interdependence, including economic interdependence, between the major states of Europe in the beginning of the 20th century, and yet they did go to war. And it was not even that they didn't appreciate the degrees of interdependence and the risks of war, but nonetheless a dynamic developed that ended up being hugely costly for all sides. And at the time, most, if not all, observers, both academics and practitioners, felt that these degrees of interdependence and the cost of conflict would be a reason to avoid war, and yet the Great War happened at enormous cost. And so that tends to motivate one to look at the question about why, even when it appears irrational for conflict to break out, do states engage in conflict. And for us, the most powerful, but not the only reason, to think that the kinds of issues that drove conflict leading to World War I might be present in the current dynamic in East Asia are things that are closely associated with what our students will recognize as the security dilemma, which is a feature of the structural situation of the relationship between a dominant power and a rising power. Those of you who haven't done your IR intro, the security dilemma basically takes the form of a situation in which states who obviously are concerned about their security are uncertain about the intentions of other states. And because they're uncertain about the intentions of other states, they have to prepare for the possibility that the worst intentions may come about. And so a state has to worry that irrespective of the public pronouncements, the protestations of one state or another, that all of their actions are peaceful or intended to be oriented towards cooperation, that in the end that they may have less benevolent designs, and therefore while you may hope for the best, you have to prepare for the worst. But the problem is that this strategy of preparing for the worst, of hedging against the worst, leads you to take measures to protect your security, particularly in terms of military activities, developing military capabilities, deployments, exercises, and the like, which you may view as being defensive, but which the other side views as offensive and threatening. The other side then looking at these inherently ambiguous actions of military modernization, of exercises, training, deployments, and stuff, then draws the similar conclusion that while you can't know for sure what the intention is, you have to prepare for the worst. And each develops this spiral of mistrust, leading to more and more actions which deepen the spiral and ultimately lead to conflict. We can talk more about how that dynamic builds and the specific features that develop it. But under uncertainty and in a situation where sides have reasons to mistrust each other, this security dilemma can build up and can lead to circumstances either of unintentional conflict or even, in some cases, preventive war. And we see this dynamic building to some extent in East Asia. That's a structural argument about why conflict might develop. But if you then overlay that with the historical experience of the region itself, the possibility, the risk of the security dilemma and the spiral developing is reinforced. And what are the specifics that takes us out of an abstract danger and into a real one? And that, of course, has to do with the history of the relationships between the countries in the region. And particularly for China, the rising power, its own history over the last 150 years of a sense that during periods of weakness, China has been exploited by other countries and has suffered as a result of its weakness. And therefore, in order to avoid a repetition of this very difficult past, the century of humiliation, needs to take strong measures to guarantee its security, especially in the military front. And those measures that it's taking, which it views as a way to avoid the rapacious behavior of others in the past by building up its military capabilities of making sure that others can't threaten it as they did in the past, leads it to develop capabilities which are seen by others, both regional powers like Japan and the countries of ASEAN, but also as the United States, as potentially threatening to us. And conversely, China looks at the United States, its military capabilities, and now its announced doctrine of the rebalance, the pivot to Asia, and looks through the lens of its own history and sees a situation in which other countries have had a strategy of profiting by China's weakness and understandably interpret the efforts of the United States to sustain its alliances, to keep its military bases in East Asia, to modernize its military capabilities, including military capabilities to attack the Chinese homeland, as a desire to perpetuate a situation in which China is weakened and vulnerable and therefore subject to coercion by the United States. Each side therefore seeing each other's actions as threatening, each side seeing its own actions as just a response to the potentially threatening actions of each other. It's a very powerful dynamic, and it's a very hard dynamic to break because no matter how many meetings you have, no matter how many summits you have in which each side solemnly pronounces on the Chinese side that we're committed to peaceful rise, on the United States side that we want a strong and prosperous China and we don't want containment, that each suspects the other of harboring different intentions, and each can find enough in their histories and their relationship to validate the more pessimistic narrative. So, for example, as the United States looks at the Chinese strategy, pessimists, skeptics, cynics on the US side say, oh, it's all Sun Tzu, right? It's all deception, putting off the enemy, the assassin's mace, all that stuff. They're talking the good game, but we know that the historic strategic culture of China and the strategy is deception and the like. And what's worse, it's not just Sun Tzu, it's also Deng Xiaoping and hide and bide, you know, and this is, Deng Xiaoping told us 20 years ago they were going to keep a low profile, but that was only until China was strong enough to be able to achieve its objectives through a different strategy. And now that China is strong and has a more capable navy, et cetera, they're throwing off the caution and the deceptive strategy of hide and bide and are now becoming an aggressive power. And then, of course, the skeptics point to not just the military modernization, but China's actions in the South China Sea, et cetera, et cetera. And of course, on the Chinese side, there's a similar narrative in which they see a United States, which on the one hand talks about, you know, not wanting to continue the Cold War, not wanting to contain China, but sustaining security alliances with countries like Japan and South Korea, which were designed to confront China when it was a communist power, part of a containment strategy of the past. Why is the United States continuing to sustain these security alliances if it doesn't have the intention of keeping China down? Why does it need these bases? Why is it developing these next generation fighters and bombers whose only purpose can be to attack China, missile defense, et cetera, et cetera? You can tell the story. Each side telling itself a credible version of why it mistrusts the long-term intentions of the other and therefore needs to take steps to counter them. And so China sees the US modernization, develops a military strategy designed to push the United States further away so it's less threatening, the so-called anti-access aerial denial strategy, which the United States sees as threatening in an attempt to undermine our alliances. The United States develops air-sea battle, which China sees as an offensive strategy designed to hold China at risk and hold China's strategic interests at risk. It's a very pernicious, very dangerous dynamic, and it exists irrespective of the specific substantive disputes between the two countries. So that's why one needs to be quite worried about the possibility of conflict. At the same time, the story that I've just told is about a set of perceptions and dynamics, but it doesn't necessarily mean that there aren't underlying reasons why the two sides would have powerful interests to live together. That there are lots of interests that the United States and China have in common, especially their interest in long-term peace and stability in the region as a source of economic prosperity. So at the end of the day, how pessimistic you are depends a little bit on whether you think that there are fundamental adverse interests between China and the United States, or whether the sources of conflict are more these perception and strategic dynamics. If it's the latter, then there may be some things that we can do to break this spiral of mistrust and undercut the security dilemma. If it's the former, if our interests really are adverse, and at the end of the day, the two sides cannot live with each other, that the minimum acceptable demands of China are too much for the United States to accept, then we will have conflict, and it's really irrespective of the security dilemma. So are the two sides' interests irreconcilable? The answer is it's hard to know, right? Because the question about what kind of world both China and the United States can live with is still one that is both unknown and currently undefined. From the US perspective, is China prepared, on the one hand, to play a larger role in the international system, to have a greater voice, to have some kind of reasonable satisfaction of its territorial disputes in the waters off China, but is willing to live with a world in which China can't dominate its neighbors, doesn't impose its own version of the Monroe Doctrine in East Asia. If that's true, if China has a relatively bounded set of demands and largely is prepared to live in a world in which it can accommodate, the interest of its neighbors, then it is possible to think about a modus vivendi and an understanding between the United States and China. On the other hand, if at the end of the day China's minimum objectives is in fact to force the United States out of East Asia and to create a new security arrangement in East Asia which is China-centric and which recreates the kind of Ming-era tributary system in which the other states, although nominally independent and autonomous, accommodate themselves to Chinese leadership, then we may have sources of conflict. And the bottom line and the major focus of our book is trying to figure out whether it's possible to decide which of those two worlds we live in. Are we living in a world in which the sources of conflict between the United States and China are driven by security dilemmas and mistrust about intentions that could be dispelled through confidence building and the kinds of measures that are designed to reassure each other about long-term intentions and to prevent a conflict from emerging because solely on the basis of mistrust as opposed to adverse interest? Or in fact, is the security dilemma actually a reflection of deeper and fundamental differences, in which case we better recognize that at the end of the day we are going to have to resolve this either through conflict or one side accepting the other's view. We don't have an answer to that question. We think it's unknown at this point whether the two sides can accommodate their differences. But we think it's imperative that both sides try to address these perceptual problems and to take steps to try to break the security dilemma through a series of confidence-building exercises that would at least reveal whether there is a basis for a common and long-term shared modus vivendi or not. And we focus on the areas that are most likely to produce this security dilemma and uncertainty, and they are, in the first instance, nuclear weapons, which have been a major source of security dilemmas in the past and were an important part of the dynamic during the conflict between the US and Soviet Union. Space, which was another area where mistrust, anxiety, and the danger of security dilemmas and the risk of preemptive conflict is very high. Maritime operations, one that we've seen a lot of focus on, and cyber, which we can talk about more in the discussion, but is obviously one of the most dangerous areas because the risk of actions based on mistrust are very high given the difficulty of knowing what the true intentions are, the problems of attribution, the problems of deception in the cyber area being very difficult. And we, throughout the book, go through a number of discussions about possible steps that each side could take to provide each other reassurance about its intentions without undermining each side's ability to take appropriate actions to defend its own security. And our argument is that each side has a responsibility to explore these kinds of confidence building and reassurance measures to at least examine whether there is a possibility for a long-term modus vivendi between the United States and China that doesn't lead to conflict. In the first best case, because if we explore them and it works, then everybody wins. In the second best case, if it doesn't work, at least we understand that the source of conflict is real and fundamental differences that, in the end of the day, each side believes are worth fighting over. That's not a happy outcome, but at least if we're going to have a conflict, it ought to be over real things rather than misperception. So let me stop at that and open it up for discussion.
I'll throw a question about IR theories of war making as state development or as state building at first and then state development. And the reason is because today some economists are worrying about secular stagnation, the fact that the world economic output or growth is slowing down, actually not recovering really much from a recession. And wars historically have also been a way to deal with that, to kind of make a giant leap in terms of mobilizing a society, of producing more, of industrialization, production back in the past. So could you address this war-making theories of AI?
So there's a huge literature on this question. And the literature largely debunks the view that war preparation is a good job producer. It goes back to Eisenhower and the military-industrial complex and stuff. And there's no question that some sectors do benefit from war mobilization, defense production, and the like. But there's actually very little evidence to suggest that as a macroeconomic strategy that war mobilization works. And even more importantly, there's also recognition that war mobilization often leads to war, as in the case of World War I, and that was not a particularly effective economic strategy. I mean, the economic consequences of World War I were obvious and dramatic. And even, some people talk about World War II, but there's little evidence in the economic literature to suggest that the war mobilization, in fact, was the answer as to why the United States succeeded in finally overcoming the Depression. And especially in today's economies, given the relatively niche role and the relatively small role that those sectors play in the economy, there's very little reason to think that as a kind of deliberate strategy, that as a growth strategy, as a macroeconomic strategy, that would be effective. So the best you could come up with is the more narrow version of the Eisenhower argument, that is that while it's not a good macroeconomic strategy, that there are certain sectors that do benefit, that they are disproportionately influential, that they're lobbyists, and that they drive these things and they sell weapons and the like. And it's harder to be able to answer that question through, good social science research. There were many people who thought that was a big factor in World War I, both in terms of German armament and also in terms of the United States. And much of the criticism in the United States from the more isolationist wing in the 30s was an argument that the United States got drawn into war by the industrialists who wanted the United States to go to war, and similarly with Germany with Krupp and all that stuff. I think I'm very skeptical that that's a significant factor in what's going on here. There's little evidence that suggests that the defense industry in the United States is a particularly powerful sector or lobby. It's true that they have made efforts to spread production all around the United States. But if you just look at the defense budget and particularly investment in procurement in the US over the last 15 or 20 years, it's been very flat. It's not been a very dynamic sector. The defense budgets are very high in the United States, but they're driven largely by operations and maintenance and personnel costs and not by either R&D or procurement. So it doesn't feel right to me to be a particularly powerful argument. And similarly in China, it's hard to see that the defense industries are that powerful. There was a time in which, when the PLA itself was more engaged in kind of the business side, that it might have had something of a factor, but since Jiang Zemin kind of got the PLA out of the defense production business, also hard to see there. So, it's an important question, it's an interesting question, but I don't see a lot of evidence that the dynamic, if you look inside the black boxes, sort of what's the dynamic in each of the countries that's driving this. I think it is much more these deeper strategic arguments. In China, the nationalist argument that when we were weak, we got exploited. Now we can be strong. We need to be strong, and this is the lesson of our history. And a similar set of arguments in the United States. So the kind of the defense industrial complex, the economic mobilization argument doesn't feel very compelling to me as a significant source of the dynamic that's creating this spiral between the United States and China. Yep.
I'm from Ukraine, and so now we have the situation where the U.S. is exclusively supporting the Ukrainian struggle for democracy, and at the same time China is offering generous support and other financial and other support to Russian side of the conflict. So my question is how on the bigger...
What support is China offering the Russian side?
Well, they are allies
I wouldn't, I mean, there are ways in which China and Russia are aligned, but I don't see China giving Russia much support in this sense, other than basically getting Russia to sell it gas cheaply, which doesn't help Russia. I mean, the Chinese are exploiting the situation, there's no doubt, but I would not put them in the category of helping out here.
Okay, but does this on the bigger picture impact the US-Chinese relationship?
No, because the Chinese, I mean, I don't think that the US feels that the Chinese, I mean, I think the Chinese get a kick out of the fact that the Russians and the United States are fighting. I think China sees an advantage in that. But I don't think that they are actively stoking this conflict. I think they are they are clearly the beneficiaries of the deepened conflict between the United States and Russia, and that's why I mentioned the gas deal, is that because of the conflict there, Russia needs to find other sources. That gives China a lot of leverage in its negotiations, and so they've gotten a deal which is much better than the deal they was on offer before all this. So China's definitely benefiting from it, but I don't think they're helping out, and so it's hard. I mean, the United States doesn't have a grievance with China, really, with respect to this. So I don't see this as being a big factor, although it's clearly China's benefiting, but it's not because it's driving it. It's just is a happy, positive bystander here.
Thank you for your talk, firstly. It was really diverse, dynamic. I didn't really have chance yet to read your book, so I got to have some questions about certain discussions that you probably have within your book. I got to be a little curious about your exact more specific stance and the position that you posit throughout your book, and because you mentioned during your talk you briefly mentioned that in order to address the perceptual problem between the United States and China, you suggested there are possible. You suggested that you discuss some possible steps that can involve diplomacy, international cooperation in order to reduce the international security dilemmas. And I got to be thinking, just by hearing that, it sounded more like a thought experiment. I got to be curious of, have you observed any events or any good examples that you think this can be a good example that you could apply later on to show the specific steps that could actually work? Excellent question. So let me give you two examples that we talk about in the book about this positive dynamic. First is in the nuclear field. As I mentioned briefly, one of the biggest dangers in the element of security dilemma between the United States and the Soviet Union was nuclear competition, right? Each side, because of the nuclear doctrines that we were developing, began to develop more and more offensive nuclear strategies, right? Each side began to develop longer-range missiles, MIRVs, all that stuff. And the problem was that each side, was developing them, each side absolutely convinced in its own mind that these were defensive measures designed to enhance deterrence, but they also had enormous offensive capability, which then felt threatening to the other side, danger of first strike. And so each side then began to develop other things, both more offensive capability and defenses, right? Because that was the response. And so you had this dynamic in which you had both sides developing offensive capability, then developing defenses, each side seeing the defenses as a defense, but the other side seeing defenses as a shield that would allow you to engage in a preemptive first strike and then be able to protect yourself against the so-called ragged retaliation, right? So defenses, ironically, became seen by each side as a part of the offensive strategy that each had. So we found ourselves in this very difficult dilemma. Each side, everything they did was seen as threatening to the other. And the big breakthrough that began to take place as during the Kennedy administration, people began to see the kind of the deep, danger of this whole strategy was to recognize that even though defenses seemed like defenses, right, that they were actually deeply threatening from an offensive point of view and very destabilizing. And it led to the ABM Treaty. And the ABM Treaty, Ronald Reagan found it very counterintuitive, but actually it had a whole lot of logic to it, because by keeping oneself vulnerable, it actually helped reassure the other side that you did not seek to have the ability to have a preemptive, decapitating first strike.
And so the decision to adopt the ABM Treaty and to dismantle the defenses provided a significant measure of reassurance and played a major role, I think, in stabilizing the nuclear competition. It then led to discussions about offensive arms control, but none of those would have been possible without the ABM Treaty. And it was a classic example. Now, in the US-China case, we have basically learned of that lesson. And it's taken on two parts. On the one part, the Chinese have not sought to replicate the early Soviet offensive nuclear strategy, which is to seek parity with the United States, right? China could have nuclear parity. There are no either technical or financial reasons why China could not build as many ICBMs and as many nuclear warheads as the United States has. It's not that difficult and it's not that expensive. But China has not done that. China has not only in its rhetoric adopted a minimum deterrence strategy for its offensive nuclear forces, but it has a force posture which gives credibility to that rhetoric. It's smaller than the United States. It's not in a high state of alert. You know, it's a modest capability. It has the ability to inflict damage, but it is not a parity force, and they've not sought to do it. On our side, we have not sought to develop defenses against this relatively modest offensive nuclear capability that China has. China can overwhelm with its current force the current defenses we have, which are focused on North Korea and Iran. And there's, you know, you would know it, and China would know it if we were trying to develop a defensive architecture, both in terms of deployments and numbers, that were designed to neutralize the Chinese deterrent. They would see it, we would see it, and they would worry and they'd build more nuclear. So we both adopted measures of reassurance. China on the offensive side, the United States on the defensive side. It hasn't been negotiated, and a lot about the book is the desirability of trying to find reassurance measures that don't require negotiation, but have strong signaling, credible signaling capacity to the other side that the intentions are benign. And this is by far the best. We have not had a nuclear competition between the United States and China in the now 51 years since China developed its nuclear capabilities. It's been very stable. There's been some modernization on each side, and everybody keeps worrying China's about to do more, but it hasn't happened, right? So that's one concrete example of places that we've done it. A second place where we've done it is more on the nonproliferation front, which is a great concern of the United States in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and into the 90s, was that China was proliferating nuclear materials and technology to other dangerous actors, particularly Pakistan, but concerns with Korea, concerns with Iran, and the like. And this was a major source of contention between the United States and China, and something I dealt with a lot during the Clinton administration. The so-called ring magnet sale to China, the M11 sales to Pakistan, the M11 sales to Pakistan, and the like, which were viewed as very threatening by the United States. And the United States would go to China, China would say, we're not doing it, we're not doing it. The United States didn't believe it, and this was creating a great deal of mistrust and suspicion. What happened? Well, first of all, the first thing that happened was China, surprisingly, you may not know this, for the first 25 years of the NPT, for the Non-Proliferation Treaty, refused to sign the NPT. It was part because it was not part of the negotiations, part of it was kind of a third world thinking, et cetera, et cetera. But in the early 90s, China finally came around to signing the NPT. And then during the course of the 90s, and part of a conversation that took place between the United States and China, China began to actually implement an export control regime that began to give credibility to the notion that China was actually trying to constrain the sale of or transfer of technology out of China to dangerous actors. And as it began to implement these export control measures, both in terms of a legal framework and then an administrative framework that made it credible, and actually began, and we could tell this, the way you can tell these things, to go after bad actors in China, companies that were proliferating, it gave a lot of credibility and confidence to the fact that China actually meant what it said, that it supported the NPT, that it did not want to see the destabilizing effects of nuclear technologies. And as China began to do more of that and to demonstrate, in credible ways that it was enforcing its own regulations, it then became a source of positive reassurance in the relationship. And the reason I mention this one is that this NPT model actually has a lot of applicability in the cyber sector as well. Because what happened is China became more transparent about its determination to enforce its rules on nuclear technologies. There became more conversation back and forth between the United States and China. And we argue in the book that a similar process would help in the cyber front. If China, in fact, believes, as it says it believes, that it is against cyber theft, cyber intrusion, et cetera, and actually begins to adopt the laws and regulations and administrative measures to go after actors in China who are doing those things, then it will give some credibility to the Chinese argument that we don't do this, that we don't support it, that we're against it. It would give the US confidence that if it's happening, it's because it's rogue actors, it's not an action of the Chinese state that's doing these things. And so we've proposed that a similar model be adopted in the cyber front to the one that was adopted in the NPT, which would then help allay some of this mistrust that is now a major source of contention between the United States and China in the cyber realm.
Sorry, real quick follow-up. Do you think you might be able to draw like some generalization from that experiences from those events, the past
So
events?
the big generalization is that the way you start this positive reassurance dynamic is each side needs to articulate to the other what it is that the other is doing that they're worried about, right? So the conversation takes the following form. We, the United States, are worried about the development of high-speed, medium and long-range cruise missiles, naval cruise missiles by China, because we believe they're threatening to our forces in the Western Pacific and are inconsistent with China's view that the United States has a legitimate reason to have military forces in the region. That bothers us, that worries us. What can you do, you China do, to reassure us that what you're doing in terms of your military modernization is not designed to force us to withdraw from the Western Pacific, but has solely defensive intentions? Are there things that you can do in terms of limiting your modernization, or showing more transparency, or focusing on the numbers of systems you deploy? What can you do to reassure us? Similarly, China comes to the United States and says, we're really concerned about all this surveillance that's taking place off the coast of China, this aerial surveillance, because we think it's threatening to us. You know, we don't think there's a legitimate basis for doing this. What can you, the United States, do to reassure us that this is not designed to keep China weak, defenseless? Once you begin to articulate those things, each side then is in a position to try to adapt its own strategy to do things that are adequate to provide defense, but are less threatening to the other. And you know, my example from the nuclear side shows that it can be done. That is, that we can get into a posture where each side believes it can defend itself in ways that are less threatening to the other. It's never going to be perfect, right? There's no such thing as purely defensive systems. There's always going to be a degree of ambiguity, but there's a continuum, and certain systems are much more destabilizing than others. Certain doctrines are more destabilizing. ASATs, for example. ASATs are hugely destabilizing, anti-satellite systems. Why? Because if a country has to worry that if a country depends on satellites for its defenses, and has to worry that early in a conflict the other side will knock them out, it leads to preemption. It leads to a spiral of preemption. And therefore, there's been a lot of focus on trying to enhance the survivability of satellites and reduce the danger from each side developing anti-satellite capabilities. And we talk a lot about that in the book. So it begins with an articulation of what is it the other side's doing that worries us, and what can you do to pursue your legitimate defensive interest in ways that are less offensively threatening to the other side's interest. That's the general pattern of what we talk about. Go ahead.
I guess two things I added in relation to North Korea and those 2 points in terms of reassurance with nuclear non-proliferation. Is there any chance that the United States missile defense in terms of North Korea could be misperceived by China as, I don't know the technical capabilities of it, but to be perceived as more of a threat to China in that defensive role? And then second of all, too, with the recent Sony hacks and then the potential U.S. response with the internet shutdown in North Korea, is that setting a precedent for a U.S. response to any potential China hacks on the U.S. private industries, anything like that?
So let's start with the defenses. I think, again, this is part of the place where having the conversation can help provide a degree of stability and a degree of reassurance, which is, from the US perspective, I think there's a high degree of confidence that the current architecture does not threaten the ability of China to effectively deliver a nuclear weapon against the United States. That the number and the types of systems we have, which would be effective against a rudimentary North Korean offensive missile capability, are simply insufficient to deal with the numbers and types of nuclear weapons we have. Now, I think China actually believes that. But if they have concerns, the point is to have a conversation and for the Chinese to say, well, here's what we're worried about your system. And the United States to say, consistent, you can't be totally transparent, but you can be some transparent about here's what we've got and here's what they can do and here's what they can't do. And you're either convinced the other side that they're not threatened, or you can take some steps. Well, if you're really worried about this, maybe there's a different way we can do this that still is effective against North Korea but is less worrisome to China. So it's worth having that conversation. And frankly, both sides have been unwilling to do that up till now. But part of the reason we started this dialogue called the Strategic Security Dialogue, which began in 2011 when I was still Deputy Secretary, was to begin to create a forum to have those kinds of conversations. And they're beginning to start to happen, where each side, if there's a concern. We also tell the Chinese, if you put a little more pressure on the North Koreans, we would have less need to do these other things. But on defenses are one of the easier areas, frankly, because there's enough transparency about this, I think, that one could be persuasive to China that this architecture doesn't work. We're having the same conversation with Russia, by the way. The Russians have been concerned about our deployments in Europe designed to deal with Iran or threatening to, and we've had a very robust dialogue. It's gone more badly recently, but that has more to do with Putin and less to do with the technical issues there. But it is exactly the kind of place where you can, I think, effectively have this conversation and be able to adjust each side's strategy in a way that meets our legitimate and undeniable. We will take steps to protect against the North Korean threat, and we have to do that, and no president's going to not do that. But there are different ways to do that. There are different architectures. There are different technologies. And some of them are relatively equally robust against North Korea, but less problematic from a Chinese point of view. And that's what we need to focus on.
Last question.
Go ahead.
So, would it be possible that sometimes domestic politics within China could play a big role? For example, the inequality issues expand and the ethnic issues become strong, and then maybe the economic development eventually gets slower than now. So people might not be really satisfied with the performance of the Communist Party. But it's a kind of way of stirring up.
Yes. Yes, and we talk about that dynamic in the book, and it's a concern. I mean, just like your point about what are other exogenous domestic political factors that feed this, and there's no question that there's a concern that because of the challenges of legitimacy that the Communist Party has in China, that if domestic factors are threatening that legitimacy, then having an external enemy whipping up fear has been a known strategy in history, shall we say. And one needs to be sensitive to this. I think that's, and by the way, it plays a little bit in US politics too. I mean, if you think about the dynamics about how the US-China relationship developed after the Chinese Civil War, I mean, there was a certain amount of that went on in the US as well. So I think we have to be sensitive to this, and we do talk a lot about the fact that leaders have to lead on these issues, that they can fuel these security dilemmas by pursuing a domestic political strategy that reinforces the other side's fear. I mean, the hope is that there's a recognition about the risks associated with that. But the problem there, I think, is one that leaders are tempted by playing that card and are excessively confident that they can manage it and they can dial it back and forth. And I'll be blunt in saying that in China, I think there's an overestimation of that. I mean, the Chinese government plays, you look at this, I won't say vis-a-vis the United States, but look at the way that the Chinese leadership uses attitudes towards Japan, right, as a strategy of domestic mobilization, right? And for a long time, it seemed that the leadership in China and the Communist Party felt you could dial it up and dial it down. If you wanted to, if you wanted to put some pressure on Japan, you'd dial up a mob and they'd trash a few Toyota stores, and then you could dial it back down again. But then what I think they've begun to realize is actually the public now with the internet and strong China and all that stuff and Weibo, and that you actually can't dial it so much. So hopefully they will be more cautious about playing that card. But the danger of miscalculation is very, very high. I think it's much higher vis-a-vis Japan because it's a more volatile issue because of the emotionality of the relationship with Japan. You just saw this. I mean, for the first time ever, Xi Jinping went down to participate in the celebration, the commemoration of the Nanjing massacre, right? I mean, a classic piece of domestic political mobilization, but very dangerous, right? Because that builds the sense, a domestic constituency for the security dilemma. And we see the converse happening on the Japanese side. So I said I talked about US-China, but the security dilemma problem is far more acute in the China-Japan context. And so if you're really worried about conflict in the near term, I worry more about China-Japan, but then of course that implicates the United States because of our treaty obligations to Japan. But you're quite right, this is an important part of the dynamic. Anyway, thank you all for your time and attention.